Canada. Hello.
First, I want to say I'm really glad we came to Toronto.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Spoiler Warning Podcast. This is part one of our coverage of the Toronto International Film Festival 2023. I am Christopher Schnese.
And I'm Stephen Miller.
And if you're joining us for the first time, the Spoiler Warning Podcast is a weekly film review program. Each week on the show, we dive in, debate, discuss, and argue over the latest films coming to a theater near you. This week and for the next few episodes, they will be coming to a theater most likely near you sometime in the near future. Ironically, a bunch of the things we are seeing will be in theaters within a few weeks. Maybe not a bunch, but some. But yeah, we're here. We're doing the festival thing. Steven and I are sitting across a coffee table from each other in an Airbnb here in Toronto. And this is for us, it's day 4 or 5 of the festival.
I think 5.
It's officially day 6 of the festival. We did a red eye on the first day, and or I guess at the end of the first day, we did a red eye into the city. We're seeing a crap ton of films. Basically, for this episode, we have hit record on the good old setup here, and we're going to record until we have to run out to see another film. So I don't know how long this episode's going to go, but it's, we're trying to find time to sit down and do recordings while we're here, let you know about stuff that we thought. This is super free form. We haven't exactly planned out how we're handling this, but we're kind of just going to go in order of which we saw films and talk about them. So you ready to do this, Stephen?
Oh, I'm ready.
All right. Let's get into it. How do we want to start? First film up is Anatomy of a Fall. Who wants to introduce it?
I can introduce it because the first day especially, we caught a few things that I had already seen at Cannes that I was just really, really excited to revisit. And the first one is Anatomy of a Fall, Justine Trier's latest film. This is the Palme d'Or winning movie at Cannes, and it is basically a procedural or a courtroom drama about an author who may or may not have murdered her husband. Basically, did he fall or was he pushed is the premise of the film.
Yeah.
What is interesting about it is this is a courtroom drama. It is very much meant to be a talky movie, but it is also unpacking a marriage and what does a marriage look like to the outside world and what does it feel like inside, and kind of what would happen if suddenly your marriage and your conversations were blown up and interrogated. Would you find a motive, yes or no, and how do you choose to be happy versus make other choices? I guess we should have thought of the format before.
No, yeah, I mean, it's fine. We'll go for it.
Yeah, so I guess we'll say what we thought and then lob to the other person.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this film at Cannes. I thought it was very provocative, and just the dialogue crackles. It's just a movie that is very juicy and has a lot of really interesting bits, especially as it pertains to the marriage of Sandra Hüller's character and her husband. There is an argument in the middle of this movie that is just riveting. One of my favorite moments of a film that I saw at Cannes this year. I have to say, watching it a second time, it lost its luster a little bit for me. I still think this is a very, very good film, but knowing what it was doing and where it was headed, the art of just watching it unfold wasn't quite as exciting as I hoped it would be. So I still really liked it. Glad I saw it a second time, but this bumped down just a smidge from the kind of raves that I was feeling back in May.
Yeah, I can see how it might have a little bit less of an impact, given that this is a long argument that takes place over time, and it's played in the context of it's a secret recording, basically, where nobody, at least one party member during the argument knew that it was taking place, but we, the audience and the courtroom and the witnesses and the prosecution and the defense, don't know what's on it really when it's being played. We're all listening to it in real time, and it sort of ebbs and flows in the way arguments go. And that is going to be used as evidence, at least in the sake of an argument. So knowing exactly what will be revealed at what point, how far through, can definitely dampen that. For me, it was my first time seeing it, so it didn't dampen it for me, obviously. I enjoyed this film a lot. We kind of talked as we were walking through the streets after the screening, maybe later that night, about, there are some aspects to French law proceedings that I don't understand enough to know, or there were certain aspects of this story's trial that kind of made me wonder how things go. But as far as what the film was doing and what it was trying to do, I really, really enjoyed the beat to beat of it. I thought it was a very, very interesting depiction of something like this. You know, I kind of related it to HBO's The Staircase.
Yeah.
I didn't watch the documentary version. I only watched the narrative version. But that was really a story of a highly charismatic person in a clearly he did it sort of situation, and you're trying to watch if his charisma can override your assumed guilt. This film isn't doing that. It's more of there's just some, legally speaking, there is an assumed guilt due to the situation and how many people weren't present and stuff like that. But what you're not watching a person who you're like, oh, they clearly did it. Now let me see if they can like talk their way out of it. You're just watching a fairly ambiguous situation and kind of watching things where you can get how either side could believe given different circumstances one way or the other. And I thought it was just a very, very interesting dissection of this relationship and kind of the court proceeding as a whole. I think, you know, there was a line of dialogue in this film that kind of states the thesis of the film, which is like when you don't know, you kind of just have to decide one way or the other. And this film is letting you, the audience, kind of do that. Like there is an eventual, there is a verdict at the end of the trial. I don't believe personally that the film is necessarily in alignment with that verdict. It's more a like just because of that whole premise. Like it's like, hey, you decide what actually happened if you can't really tell. So just you decide as you watched it.
Definitely, and there's something that it's playing with the whole way through, which is the kind of the nature of reality versus fiction in the stories we tell ourselves, and the person on trial is an author, and so not only does she have works of fiction that they can interrogate and ask how much is she borrowing from her real life, how much can we use this in the trial, but she can also weave narrative. She can make very compelling arguments with her husband, with the jury. She can turn things around and steer and control you, and the question is how much of this is honest and how much of this is the manipulation of someone who is really good at weaving narratives. And when you choose to believe, are you succumbing to fiction? Are you being manipulated? Or is this just how we live as we build little worlds and we find ourselves in them? So it's playing with a lot of stuff, and I have to assume there's some meta elements, not that Justine Triet's husband was murdered or anything like that, but the idea, she is someone who also makes films that have meta-fictional elements to it, so I think this movie was operating at many different layers. So it's a cool one.
Yeah, there's another interesting aspect to it where like the person who is representing this woman is somebody she has had a past sort of relationship with. And there's another layer to it. It's not just did she do it or not. It's does the person defending her believe that she did it or not. And it's like just the pure, like in a normal trial, that person should recuse themselves. But I guess like it's, you know, there's an interesting aspect to that as well. That was kind of fun.
There's also a clear answer to what animal he looks like. It's a meerkat.
Yeah, so that was Anatomy of a Fall. All right, rushing forward, we're going to talk about a little film called How to Have Sex, which is a story, like I think if you're a long-time listener to this podcast, you know, at least Stephen is very interested in like coming-of-age stories about like young women, you know, in situations that are like, you know, new experiences trying to like basically learn hard lessons about life, right? And this is sort of a story that I think that, you know, that you were definitely excited for going into the festival. But it's basically about a young girl. It's not, I don't remember where they are or how old. Like I was confused by how they were just buying drinks everywhere.
Yeah, well, I believe in the UK, 18, maybe even 16, you're allowed to buy beer. But I believe they are senior in high school, probably 18, and in some kind of party town, the equivalent of like a spring break mecca, but for the UK.
So it's basically a group of young girls who are off to party, and they kind of are going out. They range in various life experiences that they've had, but we kind of follow one girl who is being teased by her friends because she is a virgin, and she is going off on this vacation where all the friends want to potentially find and hook up with guys, and it's sort of her sort of experiencing this. I don't even know how many days they're on this trip. Like we'll say it's a week or something like that. Yeah. And it's kind of them meeting up with a bunch of guys and having some sort of experience with them. Yeah, I think that you know, this is a film that you know, builds tension and stuff really, really well. You're watching these young girls kind of they start off as like kind of charismatic / obnoxious youngsters who are kind of going around. Like, if I was staying at the hotel that they were at, I would be so angry and I would leave the hotel because they were just very loud and obnoxious, but they still have like an aspect of like, oh, look at them having fun. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, like, it's enough to draw you in and like care about the outcomes of what's happening for these girls. But they meet some fellas who are definitely, you just want them to not hang out with them.
Yeah.
Because you're like, there's no good that can possibly come from hanging out with these, just slackers. We'll call them slackers.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're basically watching these girls who kind of all have their agenda for the trip and kind of have competing desires of what the outcomes are, potentially competing jealousies of what outcomes they might be achieving. And you're kind of just watching them go. And, you know, I think in the end, I enjoyed the ride of this film, but when I walked away from it, it wasn't something that stood out. I know we talked a little bit comparatively about 8th grade, which you might be talking about when you get into your spiel, but it's kind of a thing where, you know, for me, it didn't hit the highs of a story of a coming-of age tale like that. It was mostly like, I know the beats this is going to hit. I'm uncomfortable with them, but let's watch this ride. And at least there is some care between these characters, and you can see sort of the drama between them that like works and all feels authentic and stuff like that. So I enjoyed it enough. It didn't blow me away. I have a feeling you liked it more than me, but why don't you let the folks know if that's true?
Yeah, this is the kind of movie that I don't really want to spoil, even tonally, which is difficult because you kind of described that it hit the beats you were expecting it to hit. For me, I would say halfway through the movie, it very much surprised me in the direction that it went. Going into it, I assumed this was just going to be a kind of keenly observed coming-of-age story, and everything I heard out of out of Cannes was making it sound like fun or identifiable or things like that. And there is fun to be had here. It is a very naturalistic looking picture of these 3, I'm going to say girls, young women, again, we don't know exactly how old they are, who are on spring break, and they're making bad decisions the way one does at that age. You know, they're partying hard, drinking, waking up feeling sick every day. And much like Andrea Arnold movies like Fishbowl and American Honey, which I loved, it is just depicting people behaving in very human ways. And at first it feels like it's going to be a lot, you know, it's going to be overwhelming. And there's this tendency, at least I would have, to try to, like, if not judge the characters, at least watch them through my hands and be like, please don't make these decisions. But the movie has so much love for them and for their flaws and the way that they relate to each other. I found it like completely charming and captivating in its kind of opening presentation of these girls. And then when the guys are brought into the picture, there is this hint of a threat, you know, when you have a lot of people together partying hard every night, especially in a very hookup obsessed culture that is ripe for disaster. And I think the movie, I just think it does a really, really, really good job of walking that tightrope of being realistic and being that the threat is real, and there's a lot of real feelings that come from this movie that can be hard to watch. But it isn't just, for me anyway, a cautionary tale where it's moralizing or saying, and that's why you don't get hammered on spring break, or that's why you don't crave the attention of other people. Like, it isn't judging the women for existing in this hookup culture. It is very much siding with them and emoting with them while also portraying some of the terrifying aspects of it. And I just thought this movie did something really interesting that it could have fumbled a million different ways. And the fact that it manages to preserve that authenticity the whole way through, I just thought it was really moving in a perspective that I hadn't seen before. So you mentioned 8th grade. I was talking about this as it feels like an older, kind of more harrowing version of 8th grade, where it's, here's a person, the character of Taz, who just wants to be accepted. She wants to be, you know, she's a great bubbly personality to be around. She's a good talker. She's fun. She's the life of the party, but she is craving some kind of acceptance into the club of, quote, the cool girls. And that is inherently difficult to watch. It can lead to some scary situations.
Yeah.
So I just thought this movie had a whole lot of heart, and I was really won over by it in ways that I was not expecting.
Yeah, for sure. I do kind of wish that like some of the heart is left pretty subtle in it, or at least characters don't get the time to show their heart as often. And you know, the film tries to bookend itself in a way that steps on that, like the real heart showing through a little bit at the end, where it's kind of like you see the actual bond and the love that some of these characters have for each other, and then it's kind of like, oh yeah, that's right, but like, let's do it, bitches. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like I kind of wish it waded into the bond that certain characters have and the support they have for each other over just the partying. But it handles it well, though. Yeah.
I feel like, to your point though, that uneasy alliance between having this deep feeling and regret and support for each other and then being like, fuck it, let's keep living. I think it is kind of saying something about how it feels to be alive and be a woman today, they actually have to carry that contradiction the whole way through. So I didn't see it as uplifting necessarily, but I saw it as a choice.
Oh no, yeah, I think it handles its subject matter very, very well. It doesn't last with me as some other things do.
Yeah.
But you know, I enjoyed it enough. I did not at all dislike this film. It just didn't stand out to me the way some other things have.
Yeah. So speaking of like films that linger, I was so excited to revisit Perfect Days, the Wim Wenders film that I first saw at Cannes. This is the story of a man who lives and works in Tokyo, and every day of his life follows a very, very similar routine. He wakes up, he waters his plants, he gets vending machine coffee, he drives past Tokyo Skytree, he listens to music on a cassette tape, and then he goes to his job, which is cleaning toilets in Tokyo, largely around Shibuya. Scrubbing away. He takes the job very seriously. He cares deeply about doing it well. And throughout that process, he just spends his time observing the world. You know, he is a quiet observer. He barely speaks in the whole movie. And he is just looking at awkward interactions with people, you know, working in toilets. As you can imagine, when you interact with a customer, there is the need to show some grace, and there's a lot of clumsiness in the attempt. He spends a lot of time just looking outside at the way light shines between the trees or the way shadows might cast on the bathroom in a particular way. And this is really just a movie about finding beauty and meaning in the small things in life and the world that you can create for yourself when you are not hiding from other emotions, but trying to make something beautiful in a life that maybe has had its share of hardship. I thought this movie was absolutely beautiful. I loved it maybe even more the second time I watched it, which is impressive for a very slow film where intentionally not a lot is happening. It's just everything I love in films. It lowers my blood pressure. I described it to you when I came out of Cannes as being like Patterson, but set in Japan, and I very much believe that. This is about finding the poetry in everyday life, and a person who minds his job and his day-to-day routine for beauty, and then it just kind of examines why would a person be like that, what happens if the flow is interrupted, and I just love it. I'm such a big fan of this movie, and I got to practice what I preached because the audience was terrible behind us in this movie, making a ton of noise. The guy sitting behind us literally would sing along with the music cues when they were happening, as if to prove that he's so smart that he knows the most famous songs on earth from the 70s and 80s. And I was angry for a few minutes, and then I decided, you know, what would this film want me to do? It would want me to look at the absurdity of a guy sitting behind me doing all this and just smile to myself and be okay with the fact that there are people out there that are going to be loud. He's having a 10 out of 10 experience, and I just have to smile and be like, it's okay. He'll get there eventually. So I love what this movie is doing. Really big fan. Very curious, Christopher, what you felt about this movie.
Yeah, so like one of the big praises I will give about this film is that I didn't notice that man that you hated during the screening, because I was at least dialed in enough to this film. It is kind of funny because like one of the things that I'm pretty sure I've talked about on the podcast, and this is going to seem like a wild swerve in the other direction, but I'll bring it back. I've never been able to play the Sims games, like The Sims, because to me it was this like distilled version of normal life, which is you have all these daily routines that you can't ever break out of, and you kind of just do all the things, and then it's time to sleep and get up and do it again. And like those games put me in this stressful state where I'm like, I'm not having fun. I'm just doing all the banal things that life envisions, and I can't do anything fun in between, and it makes me like depressed in a way where I'm like, this is not, I'm never going to play this game anymore because it's a waste of my time, and I don't see it. This film is all about what if your entire life was that, but also was beautiful, and you actually really, really enjoyed the routine of life and seeing all the little simple things, and going to the park and just observing other people who are also in the park and looking at light coming through trees and listening to music and actually like really listening, not having music on in the background or as a thing to distract you, but really just taking in the feeling of that song as you drive along and do your job and like enjoy it and stuff like that. So I think this film is actually a very, very beautiful film that really actually drew me in. Especially like that last shot like sums up the entire film, sort of just
that perfectly taking in music and feeling the whole spectrum of emotion.
Yeah. And it's like, we've talked in the past too about, films that end with like a shot just lingering on a person who has to like fucking act really hard through the beginning of where credits will start showing
Call
up.
Me By Your Name effect.
Yeah. And it's like, in this, it's like, what if that, but like every variation of that over the course of like verse to chorus. Mm-hmm. And it's, I really found myself kind of intrigued by like how much you can love washing toilets.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if you think about a job that would not be glamorous or exciting, but just like the simplicity of doing this act, but actually taking pride in doing something as simple as just purely cleaning and seeing how other people appreciate, to be fair, these are, one company that owns all these toilets, but they're all wildly different and designed in different ways. And like, there's an aspect of architectural design that is put in these Tokyo toilets that are exciting and interesting on their own. Like a person visiting for the first time will be like, oh, that was kind of a cool toilet. But like really having pride in something that you do and spending time, even if it's just like, at the end of recording this podcast, if we, gather up our cables and stuff, there shouldn't be anything in there, but there is some beauty in the way the cables coil around each other. Yeah. This film is really just about like, almost quite literally stopping and smelling the roses. You know what I mean? Like taking a chance to really just breathe in your environment and recognize the beauty in it and see other people and see, you encounter a person, you see them, maybe you see an asshole who drunkenly talks through a film like every screening here at TIFF. But maybe you don't know what their day was like. Maybe something horrible happened to them right before they came to the screening, and that's why they're drunk now and being an asshole. This is a film really about kind of like noticing somebody else in a given moment and then extrapolating out to what their entire reality is based on just seeing them sitting on a bench sadly eating a sandwich alone. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, there's something really interesting that this film is doing, and I kind of loved it for that.
I love that you loved it. I do just want to say the lead actor, Koji Yakusho, he won the Best Actor award at Cannes, and I think it was so deserving. Like he carries the movie, and it is not. The way we're describing it sounds like it is only going to be simple, like, oh, I'm enjoying everything, I'm happy, I'm just looking and smiling. But there is like a really interesting interiority that's hinted at throughout the movie of like different sadnesses and other things he's been through before. And I think he carries the weight of all of that really, really, really well. For people who have seen Paris, Texas, which is probably the most famous movie that Wim Wenders did, I think this is a really interesting comparison to the silent protagonist of that movie, where here it's someone who's like embracing the whole spectrum of emotion in the world, and he is at peace with it. Like, he isn't bottling anything down, but he is choosing to be silent and observe. And it's just a beautiful movie.
Moving on from this, very, very intriguing film, we're going to walk to a film that, let's face it, we were very excited to see it, the premise alone. And then I think, sadly, what we got was a lot of, call them interesting decisions that were made around this. This is a film called His Three Daughters, which is basically about three sisters. Some of them are coming home. One of them already lived there. But basically, their father is ailing and probably won't be around very much longer, and they are sort of gathering to basically it's at home hospice sort of situation, and they're kind of taking care of duties and talking about how they're going to deal with him as he is potentially dying very soon. And from literally the opening second of this film, it was clear that there were directorial decisions that were being made about the style of the dialogue and the acting choices that characters were making that, I mean, I'll let Steven speak for himself, but they didn't work for me. It really felt like it was going for like a Wes Anderson style quick dialogue, but it was missing all of the wit, and it was wildly mistoned for what the story was that was going on. As it started, I was like, I'm definitely, this is not vibing with me, and the film never really won me back. I think we might actually disagree, but at the ending, I felt like it was at least the emotional beats of the ending of this film, I think, do work in isolation. Not enough to bring me around on this film, but I was like, I felt it worked, and it had finally hit the correct tone for what it should have been going for. But what do you know? The three daughters are not talking in any of that scene. So it's like all of the stuff that worked were not the main characters that carried the story. The things that worked were this emotional beat towards the end of the film where a different character gets to speak on their own behalf. And it's sort of, I thought it was a wild swing and a miss. And this was my first bummer of the festival so far. Stephen, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with you. So the draw of this film is honestly the cast. The three daughters are Carrie Coon, Elizabeth Olsen, and Natasha Lyonne, who are three wildly different types of actresses in the roles they choose to play. And the movie is kind of playing to them. Each of the daughters has very distinct personality. You know, the Carrie Coon daughter, she seems like the eldest or the alpha of the group. At least she's the planner. She's I have to do everything myself. She's very brash. She's like very task oriented. Elizabeth Olsen plays a kind of more spacey. She's like a deadhead, and she wants to be peace and love and do yoga in the mornings and all of that. And then Natasha Lyonne, of course, plays a Natasha Lyonne character. She smokes weed. She does sports betting, and she's someone who just wants everyone to kind of shut the fuck up or be real to each other rather than put on a facade.
Yeah.
The movie feels very, very, very much like characters are reciting a monologue for some kind of audition to be in a school play. Like, it feels so written to me. Like, you can hear the punctuation when they say the sentences, and it is like breathless. When you mention Wes Anderson, it's because characters are delivering dialogue like Jason Schwartzman in Asteroid City or something. They are breathlessly saying things before a normal human being could possibly have actually decided what they wanted to say. At first, I was hoping this was all intentional as a way of trying to subvert it. Like, the daughters are performing grief to each other. They're going through the motions. They're saying the thing they believe you are meant to say when your father is dying. And I was hoping there would be a kind of turnaround moment where the movie would open up and just the beating heart would come out and it would let go of all that facade. But it doesn't really. For the entire film, as far as I can tell, Natasha Lyonne is the only real human character in this, and that is beyond when it would just be a statement of how the daughters are. It seemed like just the fundamental way this movie was made, and that made it really ring false to me because there are a lot of, quote, big moments. There are a lot of things that you could imagine being the Adam Driver punching a hole in the wall marriage story moment in this, like as if it were written to be the big dramatic back and forth that would get played in the Oscar reel, and I just felt like none of it rang true at all. And those beats that, to your point, might work in isolation, emotionally, it just felt like too little too late. So I received it as emotional manipulation rather than as, they're doing something beautiful here. To me, this was really just not a successful film at all.
Yeah, and the only reason it worked for me is because it didn't require the sisters to have earned it, because they weren't the ones causing it. So it was like a person who hadn't committed the crimes of the previous part of the film was getting to do their own thing in a film where they were hitting exactly what they were trying to do. And it was like, oh yeah, this is great. And another good example too of the lack of authenticity. It is a trope that young girl, like if you grow up with really, really close sisters, you kind of have your own language. You have ways of talking that other people have no idea what you're talking about because you have this special bond that you sort of, sometimes it's just like, twins. Sometimes it's just girls all around the same age. But there's like several parts of this film where they talk to each other in this made up language, but there's no like, we are trying to avoid letting somebody know what we're communicating. It's like people are in the other room and they just go, and they're like, yep. Well, I'm going to, and you're like, I get what you're doing. They have their own language, but why? It doesn't feel natural. It feels like, hey, you know how like sisters who grew up really close to each other have their own language? Here's them doing their own language. And it just didn't feel real at all to me. But it's like I knew exactly the trope it was trying to go for, but I was like, why this feels so
100%. Structurally and on the page, I can kind of get why this might have seemed like a home run, but I just don't think it came together at all. Like, if you believed all of it, those moments could be beautiful, but you don't. At least I didn't believe them, and that hurt the film a lot.
And that's the thing is, you just make different acting choices, and this film is pretty decent.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's such a conscious choice to make it be this way, and that didn't work at all for me. And it's like, that's the thing where it's like, wow, I could, like, literally don't change the script at all. Just change the directing choices and, like, the notes you're giving to your actors, and your film is fine. Which just sounds like me being an asshole now. But hey, that's just the way I feel.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to the next film that we saw, I am going to butcher French pronunciations. Wow, I'm going to butcher English pronunciations, apparently. But this is Les Indésirables from Lodge Lee. This is a follow-up to Les Miserables, which came out in 2019, I believe, maybe 2018. It was a Cannes premiere. And that story, that original one, Les Miserables, was this kind of powder keg type of film. It was about police brutality in a largely African immigrant suburb of, I believe it's meant to be a suburb of Paris, but it's somewhere in France for sure.
Yeah.
And that film was all about how an act of police brutality could eventually snowball into a full-on riot. And that film really ended with this kind of incendiary challenge to the audience of rise up and fight. It was an outcry of anger. And so I was really, really, really excited for this movie to see what is this director going to do next. He made the challenge. He did the battle cry. Now this felt like the Wire's attempt to now let's zoom out and look at the whole structure. This movie is looking at, again, a very similar neighborhood, in particular.
It feels like the same building.
It might be the same building.
And it starts with the same drone shot, right? So it's like, I kept being like, this feels like it's the same exact complex.
Yes, and this is film 2 in an intended trilogy. I'm not sure what the third one is going to be called, but that is apparently he is trying to make some broad statement about all of them. But yeah, it takes place in kind of a large, crammed apartment building where this immigrant community lives, and clearly the building is not being maintained. They're packed together, and it is zooming out and looking at the political structures. A new mayor, an interim mayor, is being elected. He is starting to enact policies because he wants to be elected, and he wants to look good and be creating, quote, safety in the community. And those policies are very regressive and are pushing and making life even harder for the immigrants in the community. Yeah. And this is about the kind of power struggle where he and the police lash out in one direction. And then in the people actually living in the apartment buildings, we kind of have two example characters where one is, she is more politically open. She wants to work within the system. Like she literally already works in government in some capacity, I believe in the housing department.
Yeah, she works in the people who help assign places that you can move into. Like she's part of that. Like, I don't know if it's a raffle or what it is, but she's like home placement that's like whatever that organization is called over there, that's what she works as a volunteer or something for.
Yeah, and she's kind of the stand-in of the person who thinks you might be able to improve the system from within by getting a voice, rallying people, exerting pressures like nonviolent protest, raising your voice, voting, things like that. And so she has this one path where she wants to try to influence the mayor. And then there's another character who is kind of the stand-in for the person who has been disillusioned over time, who maybe started out being that political optimist, but now feels that there's no hope left but to just fight back. And like the only way to fight fire with fire is to close yourself off.
Literally fight it with fire.
Exactly. And so in a way, what I would say, I love what this movie is going for. Like I appreciate the director's vision, and I like this as a sequel to number one, and I kind of am interested to see how he caps off this whole trilogy. But as a standalone picture, it's like it's a parable where it is so obvious where the characters are going to go and what beats they need to hit. It didn't feel like it gave enough interiority to them for me to believe the actions of everyone involved.
Yeah.
It was a bit too simple, and even though it does have kind of big moving set pieces in it, compared to Les Miserables, it just felt like it was tasked with a harder challenge, which is let's present the what next ? And what next is just inherently less moving and harder to make feel like a rallying cry. And that meant I had to watch this movie as if it were just a straightforward naturalistic drama, and it is not totally naturalistic. It doesn't give enough interiority to the characters for you to really feel why they're making the choices they make. So
yeah.
I appreciated it. I liked it more than I disliked it, but I definitely think it is a step down from Les Miserables, and that is unfortunate. But hopefully the third movie is going to come back and capstone all of it, and then as one vision, the trilogy will be something that I really can stand behind.
Yeah, so Stephen gave me homework to watch Les Miserables, and I had watched it the Saturday basically before we came here, so that film was pretty fresh in my mind, and I was kind of excited going into this because I did enjoy that film. But that film is also a powder keg, and it's like literally one act of police overreach can be throwing a match into a situation that can ignite everything and burn it all down, right? It's sort of a violence begets violence sort of, like everything is so unstable that if everybody isn't working to keep things going, it's all going to collapse and we're going to be screwed. This film is more of and it's funny too because there are so many so many people from the previous film exist here playing very, very similar roles, and it feels almost like not just a spiritual sequel, but like aged up versions of those same characters. They have the same mentalities and they're playing similar roles, and it's kind of, when you take the situation from being an act that happens to a very young person and causing society to overrun, and then now you have like, it's all not elevated from the standpoint of being like higher art. It's elevated in the standpoint of like, it's now like more adults that are not just like young cops doing dumb shit and then a bunch of kids like mucking about and then other territory disputing different groups of people, like kind of all leading towards this event that could possibly cause a bunch of unrest in the city. It's like a bunch of bureaucratic stuff, and it's kind of trying to look from this is how it is in the streets in the previous film, and this is how the bureaucratic system is now, and it's like that is inherently less interesting. Like it's more face value. It's more like, yeah, this is clearly bad. This interim guy is an asshole and he's doing stuff that's bad, but it's like there's no nuance there, and there isn't a lit match slowly burning towards like this fuse that's burning towards an explosion that's going to happen. It's like, okay, like I'm sure something's going to go down at this end of this film, but it doesn't feel like a constant worry of dread that is building. And I think that overall this film feels more heady, I guess.
Yeah.
At the sacrifice of being more visceral, and it doesn't have the weight that first film does. I'm still curious where the third film will eventually go, but it felt like it was working more on paper than it was in the reality of the film. And most of my enjoyment of the film came from recognizing all the cast members and feeling the ways the film was homaging the previous film, or feeling at least like it's literally in the same canon, right? And I think that if I wouldn't have done the homework that you gave me, Stephen, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed this film at all. To be honest, like it's more of a thing where like I'm part of this film series now, and I appreciate the follow-up, but I don't. It wouldn't. If I watched these out of order, I might not have gone back and checked out the first one based on this one.
Yeah,
So,
I understand that. I will say, even though the broad strokes didn't totally come together for me, there were a bunch of individual moments that still felt well observed. Like there's a restaurant that exists in this apartment, and it's like an unlicensed restaurant, but it's where everyone congregates. There's the different way people get around the challenges of a building with no working elevator, having to conduct a funeral or move furniture or things like that. There are a lot of things that felt very well observed and interesting that I think are going to live with me, but the broader story as a whole didn't add up to a narrative that I'm going to remember.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You're hitting it on the head for me. Is like I'm the narrative guy. Like, you really need to give me the narrative. Everything you're talking about as far as the depiction of everybody involved in the story is like perfect, and like it's all that is really, really compelling. But what I want is something that narratively drives me to be like, oh shit, what's going to happen next? How do we solve this problem? Like I really want to follow these characters and not just be like, well, we know the obvious solution.
Right.
But yeah, all in all, I wasn't bummed to have watched it. It didn't hit me the way the first film did. Mm-hmm. All right, so next up on the list is a little film that we saw called American Fiction. American Fiction stars Jeffrey Wright, and basically he is playing a black professor and author who has been becoming a little disgruntled by the fact that no publishers are buying his books, and becoming even more disgruntled when he sees that a lot of these publishers, especially white publishers, are in this mode where they're trying to buy, I guess for lack of a better phrase, blacker and blacker books, or at least books that the black publisher or the white publishers feel are representative of what they think black authors should be. So he one night I guess an attempt at irony to write the blackest book that he can, and much to his surprise, interest forms around this book that was written by this pseudonym character of his, and it's sort of takedown of the current publishing industry, and interesting look at what this character believes the merit is of writing books and stuff. This is a film that is incredibly funny. I had a great time watching it. I think it's a big crowd pleaser, but it's also like surprisingly like emotionally poignant. Like, there is the takedown of the current publishing industry and stuff like that. That whole satire is there, but it's also like has this huge emotional heart to it. This is a film. At the festival, we've seen a number of films that involve family tragedy, involve romantic entanglements, and this film kind of in a way blows most of those out of the water. There is a scene in this film that involves the reading of I guess it's an obituary. It's like sort of a statement of somebody's passing, and like that is it's almost played for a joke, but like in that moment you find out more about this character than we have in many other films that we've seen, and I just found that like the highs and the lows emotionally of this film are so much stronger than most of the stuff we've ever seen. Plus, it is just, never gonna not enjoy taking the piss out of white people. He says, as a white person podcasting on a podcast full of white people. But it's incredibly funny. Nice biting satire. Performances are amazing, and it's a really, really fun time. And I didn't know what to expect going into it. I was optimistic it was going to be fun, and I was kind of blown away from the minute it started. So, yeah. Stephen, what did you think of American Fiction? Yeah,
I adored American Fiction. I thought it was great. It is, like you said, a totally biting satire. It has some very big, funny moments, but it's the kind of movie that I love seeing with an audience and also feel deeply uncomfortable seeing with an audience, because there are laughs here. Like, it is making a mockery of the appetite white audiences in America have for what at least the character of Monk Ellison sees as like reductive stories about black trauma, things that flatten, things that are oversimplifying and overly moralistic and quote authentic or quote raw. And that is a tightrope dance, and the risk that audiences are going to be laughing for, quote, the wrong reasons or not seeing themselves being implicated in the thing they're laughing at. It is both so strong, and also part of the thrill of watching this movie is like how incendiary and fucking with the audience it is the whole way through. I think what really makes this movie interesting is it is very clearly a satire. It is very clearly stems from a cynical look at like a certain appetite, again, that white American readers and movie watchers have. This is based on a book from 2001. I'm not sure how much has been updated to make it feel relevant to the 2020s, but it feels like remarkably of this moment in terms of what it is making fun of. But it is also kind of looping back and telling the story of this neurotic guy played by Jeffrey Wright, who he can see the machinery at play. He can see how people write these, quote, best-selling books. He thinks he knows how to do it. He thinks he knows how to phone it in. And because he sees how the machinery works, he thinks it's all bullshit. And I don't think the movie is saying he is right. It does some interesting things to also say, like, him living this life where he is like too cool for school and cynically dismissing everything else, that's also flattening of the whole of human experience. And that also isn't being open and authentic either. And it's just doing something really interesting where it really feels like an author and a filmmaker collectively wrestling in a movie and inviting you to wrestle with them and go through this kind of roller coaster. Issa Rae plays an author that is both the subject of his kind of ire, or at least his cynicism at the beginning of the movie, and also gets to be fleshed out and have more nuanced, more interesting thoughts and feelings. There's a girlfriend character of romantic entanglement who also enjoys both the kind of stuff that Monk writes and also enjoys these kind of popular things that he's dismissed out of hand, even though he himself admits he's never read them. So I just thought this movie was doing so much interesting stuff where it is like, you know, Sorry to Bother You is a movie that was referenced in the Q&A that I was definitely thinking of. This is almost the upside down Sorry to Bother You, right? Rather than making fun of someone who can do the, quote, white voice, this is a movie making fun of white audiences' appetites for a phoned in, flattened down version of what they think the black voice is. Yeah. But it just is also like I'm a sucker for movies about getting caught in your own head and kind of the perils of being overly neurotic and overthinking yourself out of relationships and out of love and empathy. And I think that, to your point, the movie does the empathy thing well, too. It does the personal family life. It shows the, like, kind of gallows humor that he and his family trade in, that maybe it's both heartwarming and also an example of his aversion to certain kinds of sentiment, which doesn't make the sentiment bad. It's just not who he is. And I just love this movie. I thought it was so clever. And I loved feeling uncomfortable in an audience and just like feeling like everyone is going through this ride together. So this was one of my highlights of the festival for sure. And
it was great. And like going back to some of those emotional beats too, like, you know, there is a scene in this film where somebody finds out that they were proposed to, or I guess somebody else finds out that a person who is talking to them was proposed to. And like, we know nothing about the history of any of these characters, but it still made me tear up just the joy that character was expressing in the moment of like, hey, this is happening now. And everybody's genuine happiness for that person was like, how is this film that did we see it around? We saw it around the time that we saw His Three Daughters, right?
I think so. Yeah, same day.
Yeah. Because I don't know if it's like a thing where it's like just in opposition to a film like that, the authenticity of it rings true so much. But it's like, I found myself really invested in who these characters were. And then even like seeing like Jeffrey Wright's character of like, he has a view of the world and he's angry about that. And the more what he thinks is his opinion being reinforced gets, the more angry he gets. And then it starts to pull down on who his character is. And then now you care not about like the joke of how far this thing is going in the satire, but about the actual journey this character is. And you want him to succeed, not financially, but exceed emotionally with the characters that is there. So I had an amazing time with it.
Yeah. And maybe I'm reading too much into the movie, but I feel like, so it has this structure where it's largely around Jeffrey Wright, this author who again is doing this thing that starts out as a cynical joke and then keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he gets more frustrated in the process. And then in the periphery are all of these stories that could be seen as the kind of like simple, heartwarming stories that he is rebelling against, right? There's like a family tragedy. There's the acceptance of a queer sibling of his. There's this heartfelt romance that we don't get any access to of two people that seem a little bit, quote, more like simple in how they're fleshed out. Like we don't get to know a lot about them. And it's almost like he has all these real narratives and he's blind to the fact that those also exist and there's merit in them. And I just think the movie is doing something intimate with like sentiment and cynicism by smushing them all together. And I don't know exactly what it's saying there, but I think that combination is part of what makes it more than just a scathing satire.
Yeah. So random question that just came to me as you were going through that just now. Once again, haven't read the book that the film was based on, so I don't know how far these separate apart. But do you think there's also a kind of meta thing happening here where the film is a specific film about a specific subject where like the satire is front and center, but do you think the filmmaker is also, I could also do all those other stories perfectly, and I'm going to show you how perfectly I could do them, but I'm giving you the satire you came to sit down in the seat to see, but also I'm going to emotionally hit you with all these beats that would be in all the other films, because like there are aspects of this film that overlap with every other film we've seen
right
at the festival, and in a lot of those cases, again, American fiction does it better. And it's just like, it's interesting to see sort of just like the magic trick that's happening where it's like, yes, you want to consume X, but I am also going to show you that like the stuff that I can write outside of satire is really, really strong and good and impactful. So
yeah, I think there's definitely something where in the wrong hands it would feel too clever by a half, because it does seem like it is giving you all the unbearable weight of massive talent sort of things of like, I'm diving into a bunch of different genres just to show that I can do it.
Yeah.
But there's so much softness and empathy and self-questioning that goes along with it that I love the way it ties together. It feels like even if he is flexing, it doesn't feel like a show off. It feels like I'm flexing. Do you understand how exhausting it is to see how all the strings are being pulled and to be like frustrated, but know that it's moving, but also not like why it's moving? And I just hears all of it. You know, there's this feeling that he's just handing you everything.
Moving on.
Yeah, so I believe if my list is correct, the next one up is Wicked Little Letters. That was a film that I honestly read nothing about pretty much any of these movies going into the festival. I picked them, and then I remember that I'm excited to watch them, and then I completely forget why I'm excited to watch them and just settle in for a nice surprise. This is a period piece in the 1920s between Olivia Colman and Jessie Buckley. Olivia Colman plays this kind of very prim and proper woman who's still living at home with her family in England. She is an extremely good woman, righteous, church-bound, leads all of these women's groups with her friends. She's prim and proper. And Jessie Buckley is the person freshly in town from Ireland who has a filthy mouth. She drinks like a sailor. She curses. She is the polar opposite of Olivia Colman's kind of prim and proper character. And this film centers around a collection of letters, mysterious anonymous letters that have been sent to Olivia Colman's character that are deeply, deeply disparaging, cursing nonstop in ways that I told you offline remind me of this sketch about Vanessa Bayer like cursing and not even like knowing exactly what she's saying, but just cramming all these dirty words together. Yeah. This movie is just an absolute delight. Like this quote mystery that isn't really a mystery of who is sending the letters and what is going to happen. It is just a completely juicy story for these two actresses to play together, and they're having the time of their goddamn lives doing it. I'm not going to say this movie is high art or has some incredibly incisive message that it is making or anything like that, but for 100 minutes, I had an absolute ball just watching them go at it with each other. Just two really, really meaty roles that they make the most of. It's a fun crowd pleaser. The audience was hooting and hollering the whole time. The Q&A was fun afterwards. It's the kind of movie that I don't know if I would have watched if I were not at a festival where it is playing, but I am super glad that I did, just for the kind of big shit-eating grin that I left the theater with. 'Cause this is a movie that basically makes you feel like you are doing something naughty by listening to bad words. And in a world where we curse constantly, it is kind of amazing that the movie it puts you in that mindset of a prim and proper time and place where women at least weren't allowed to speak this way, and then makes it feel so daring and fun and silly when they get to burst out of their shell that I don't know. I just really enjoyed what this movie was doing, even if at the end of the day it is quite light fare.
Yeah. I think when looking through all the films that were playing at the festival, I saw this and I immediately thought like female Banshees of Inisherin.
Oh yeah.
And that's kind of why I was interested in checking it out. I didn't dive too deep into what the actual story behind the story was, but I was excited for it. And yeah, I think you get exactly what you're expecting from this. Two amazingly talented actors playing off each other and just having an amazing time. And it's a really, really fun film. And it's like as you said, like that skit, it's about, it feels like somebody who doesn't know how to cursing in all the things that they think really bad cursing is. And then, another character who does curse, maybe potentially being in trouble, and it's kind of like, it's really, really fun. It's just an amazing time. And like you said, it's already fleeting in my head, right? Like it's already partially gone. But when you're sitting there in a theater watching that happen with a crowd of people who are all responding in the exact same way and enjoying it, I'm sure there was somebody in that theater who was like, oh, let's go sit down and see what's happening in the theater. Somebody definitely had problems with that film. Like somebody in that crowd, an older woman, like just like someone's really nice grandmother was just like sitting in the back getting ready to see her favorite actor in the world, and then just got like completely shocked and had to wander her way out of the theater. But for everyone else, it was an amazing time. And people should check this out when it comes out to theaters, which I'm sure it will be.
Yeah, I'm sure.
All right, now we are moving on to a little film called Great Absence, which is a story of a young man and his estranged father, and he is sort of getting it. Basically, his father was starting to go through essentially dementia, I guess, and it's sort of a like the father was living in sort of like a like machinist or a memento sort of situation where like everything was getting written down constantly and referencing it, and the kid is sort of getting to know his estranged father through the notes the father was leaving himself to figure out how to kind of survive in the world. I am going to pass this along to Stephen to talk more about it. I don't have anything really negative to say about the film. It's just more of a film that like I was watching and following along, but it wasn't fully gripping me in the moment. So I don't have a lot of things to say about it. But Stephen, do you want to talk more about Great Absence?
Yeah, sure. It's hard to speak much to the plot of Great Absence because this is very much a moody tone poem of a movie. It isn't so much a kind of plotty work where there's some grand reveal that you get to in the end, though there are some emotional reveals. But really what this movie is about is an estranged son visiting his father now that his father's memory is no longer there, and kind of putting together the pieces of what was his father's life, like who was this man that he barely knows now, how can I understand the good and the bad of him, and then just kind of the hole left behind when someone is not a part of your life, and like realizing that you can never fully understand them. It's a movie that I thought was rather beautiful in moments. Like I think it's really lovely. It's slow moving. It has some really nice emotional voiceover moments in particular in what I thought was going to be the end of the film. But it does outwear its welcome a little bit. This is like a 2.5-hour film that I think could have easily been 2 hours and stuck the landing in terms of the emotions that it's playing with. But I enjoyed it. I thought it just was visually really lovely. I thought the emotions were really strong in the movie, but at the end of the day, it is a slow cinema type of thing. It isn't something that left a long impression on me, at least in terms of plot or character growth.
Yeah. And two, this is one of the things that for the festival they did have a trailer for, and I did watch the trailer for it, and I was thinking like, I don't know if I'm going to vibe with this film, but the trailer looks beautiful, and like the film executes on that for sure. I just didn't fully connect with it as a whole.
Yeah, it's very much a film that lives in negative space. Like, it isn't showing you the big emotional moments. It's letting silence do the talking and letting you kind of infer what the son is thinking through and how the past he had with his father was and why it's meaningful for him to watch these things. And that is something that I admire on like a tonal level, but it can make it a little bit harder to get pulled in. But still, I was happy that I watched this. It's something that, at least in terms of the emotions that it brought out, it will live with me for a while, but the plot, honestly, is already starting to leave. The next film in the list is a little movie called Daddio. This is a two-hander. Like, quite literally, there are only two speaking roles in the movie, and they are Dakota Johnson and Sean Penn. Dakota Johnson plays a woman who is landing at JFK and hailing a taxi to go home to Manhattan in Midtown, and Sean Penn plays the taxi driver that picks her up. This is a film that is all conversation. It is, quote, near real time. That is at least the intention of the film. It basically flows the way that a long cab ride home, part of it being stuck in traffic, would flow. And it's just these two very different people, different places in their life, different types of human beings, having a moment of conversation. They talk about life, they talk about sex, they talk about some of the joys they've had. They kind of up the ante with each other to get them to slowly reveal more and more to one another. And I thought it is very impressive that this movie works at all. It is the sort of thing that there are precedents, My Dinner with Andre, the Before movies. There are definitely movies that can make it a full length, just having a conversation, but it's really, really hard to do. And to this film's credit, especially to the two stars, they make it captivating. They make you always engaged with what they're doing. And the way they slowly reveal more and more pieces of themselves is really, really well done. I admired it a lot. I wanted it to have something deeper to say in all that revelation, and I feel like it kind of circled the same themes over and over again without ever really mining for more. So I think my expectations were a little bit too high once I realized how good it had the potential to be.
Yeah.
I'm still very glad that I saw it. I still definitely recommend this to anyone, but I feel like these two actors especially could have done something incredible, and instead I got something that felt very true to life in terms of the way two people reveal each other to each other, but it didn't quite hit the highs or the depth that I wanted it to hit. But I think you loved this movie more than I did.
I mean, yeah, I definitely loved it more than you did. I love this film a lot. And I think, the films that you're comparing it to, the films that are in this genre of two people meeting and having these long, prolonged conversations that seemingly are the only thing that the film is centered around. One of the things that makes those two things different, or these and those other films, is those other films are characters coming together for an interest in coming together, right? Those are two people who meet, and now this is them sort of figuring out what their chemistry is together. And this film is more about two people who, under any other given circumstance, would write the other person off.
Yeah.
And it's only the fact that they're together. This is not two people romantically finding each other and then potentially like something happens after the movie's over, right? These are two people who have a brief moment in time, decide to extend a courtesy conversation to another person that goes to wildly inappropriate places. And at every time it takes one of those turns, one of the two people could decide to disconnect and move away. But because they're this is more like a stuck in an elevator sort of film, right? It just happens to be that one of the people is driving that elevator. But it's a type of story where it's like, these are the meaningful conversations that could be impactful that you could have with every single person that you meet on the street if you live in a major city, right? Like, this film isn't going to work in like a rural setting or something like that. But like being, every time you get into a lift, every time you interact with a person in the lobby of your hotel, or this film is kind of finding these chance meetings and just having a conversation that should mean nothing could mean a lot to you and at least communicate. Do all the characters, like, the longer the time goes on from the end of this film to whatever their life becomes, they will let go of and loosen up. It's not like their life was actually changed necessarily, but they do have, like, the night means something to both people. And I really like what it's doing there. The conversation isn't always insightful, but the interaction between these two people is insightful. And just two people realizing that the other person cares enough to entertain the idea of having the conversation has its own kind of beauty and interesting thing there. And just the performances are great. Like it's a different kind of funny than Wicked Little Letters, but it is almost as strong in moments. Like both actors are showing their range of like these characters that they're playing, and it's like I found it a really, really impressive feat. And I just, I was drawn in and kind of in love with both characters in this film, in different ways. But like, it was a great time for me. Now to another film, which, is also about big city living. And that is a little film called Concrete Utopia, which is basically a film about living in these giant, like, company-owned skyscrapers in Korea. And, some, like, giant disaster happens as this film is starting, and kind of all of Korea is reduced to rubble. It's basically like a Roland Emmerich film at the very start of this film. And then what we're watching is there is one remaining sort of half of a high-rise building where people can live. And this concrete utopia is sort of what happens when the people, the residents of this one last standing building decide to build their own little, like, system of government, I guess, that rules who's allowed to live in or outside of this apartment. And it is, from the original image and the description of what this film was supposed to be, it felt like it was supposed to be sort of documentary-ish. And what we got was like a very, very modern film that was wildly different than what I was expecting. It's kind of fun. It's fun. It's silly. It is weird, and it's sort of just, like what happens when, a group of people, and obviously this film has got all sorts of metaphors in there. But yeah, I don't know that I liked it. I was entertained as hell by it. Just watching it's a post-apocalyptic world, but instead of it being like a whole town, it's one little like apartment building that people are trying to, create a us versus them sort of scenario where only the residents are allowed to live there and everybody else has to fend for themselves on the outside world, and just what happens to society as it breaks down as people realize that this isn't a good way to live. Stephen, I know you were definitely excited at the possibility for this film.
Oh, yeah.
How did it work out for you?
Yeah, this is one of those things that, again, I think of as a very festival experience, is seeing these movies with a brilliant premise, like a central metaphor. You completely understand why it was created, why there was so much passion behind it. And there's definitely a joy that you feel just watching someone get their vision put to screen. Having that idea and being like, you fucking did it. You made a feature film out of this idea. The metaphor is out there now. It's ours now. And there's a joy. There's an excitement to it. And to this film's credit, it is never boring, right? It always continues to maintain the story, keeps upping the stakes. I enjoyed it well enough. I do feel like after the core idea, this us versus them mentality, how quickly people turn into warring with each other and fighting for their own survival, very much a Triangle of Sadness third act type of thing, right?
Yeah.
It takes this idea where you're like, I get what you're doing. I totally see what you're doing. Now what? What are you going to do now that the core exists? And I feel like this movie didn't really do anything surprising with that core idea. It just kind of, it planted the seeds and then followed it along for a 2-hour semi-action-y, semi-sci-fi-y, mostly drama-y movie, and it was fine. It was completely fine. But when I compare it to like a Snowpiercer or something like that, clearly this is not in that tier of film. It's something where the central metaphor is something that will probably linger for a while, but this feels like a short film that was turned into a feature without having a feature length worth of ideas.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what I would do to fill out a feature film and keep that central metaphor alive. But for me, this one just kind of, it mostly fizzled or felt like repetitive after the first 20 minutes or so.
So I will say this. I kind of saw this film as leaning more into satire and humor, like a dark humor, I guess, more than actual genuine drama. Like there are moments that were, it's got the swelling music, but I interpreted it as ironic. Like I was not emotional once during this film. even when there were really, like, there are moments where you're supposed to be crying, but I interpreted it as ironic crying. Like, this is the moment in the film where, you know, these characters would be saying this. And like, I never bought it as being real. I only bought it as being metaphorical, satirical, and all that kind of stuff. So that could be my calibration problem. But it definitely felt like it wasn't really trying to make you feel so much as, like, think at the start, and then it's almost like a thing where it sets up a premise where it knows you understand that the premise would never work in real life. Right. And then you're just watching the fun of how they interpret how it would happen if somebody tried to actually do this in an apocalypse.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the exercise is successful. It's just the film doesn't necessarily linger with me. It's more of a film where, like, if you just, like, you know, if you were like, what is this film? Like, if it popped up on Netflix and it was like #2 in 5 countries, and you're like, all right, let me check this out. You watch them and be like, whoa, that was kind of fun.
Oh yeah, this would crush it. And it seems like that's almost what it's aiming for. It's like the kind of movie that could be discovered on Netflix. And in that context, you would say, wow, this has like an incisive social point. It's like it's satirizing something in an interesting way. It's making me think. I get it. It's just, when you're calibrated to, I am watching a film at the Toronto Film Festival that has this premise, there's just a lot of times when characters are learning something that we already knew about or we implicitly understood, and it isn't like, I didn't see those as being played for laughs, really. I saw those as just going through the motions to tell a whole story. Yeah. And there were just times like that where it felt dramatically not that compelling to me. But still, I love that movies like this exist, and especially that more big bombastic genre films are getting celebrated here rather than only being like kind of personal intimate dramas. Like I enjoy this was a great way to kind of break up our schedule for that day.
Yeah. And it would be a good pairing if you watch as a double feature with The Platform.
Oh yeah, 100%, which I believe we reviewed at the time as being Snowpiercer but vertical instead of horizontal.
Yes, Snowpiercer in an elevator.
Yeah. So the hard pivot to the last film that I think we'll be talking about today, certainly the last film that we watched on that particular day, was something that I had seen before at Cannes. It was far and away my favorite film at Cannes. It is very likely my number 1 or 2 favorite film of this year so far. I mean, it's so different from other things, it's hard to really rank. I hope I'm not overhyping it. I obviously am. But this is The Zone of Interest by Jonathan Glazer. We both, at some point, watched Under the Skin, Jonathan Glazer's previous film, following Scarlett Johansson as a kind of, I believe she's an alien.
Yeah, she's an alien. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed that film, but it is not emotionally stirring for me. Like, it is, the filmmaking kept her at a total remove on purpose. Like, you are watching her as if she were just a real person driving through, like, the cash cab or something. And
she quite literally was in a lot of those scenes.
Yeah.
Like, she was actually filmmaking wise, she was literally picking up strangers, and they weren't like privy to the fact that a movie was being made. So
exactly. And so it was experimentally very, very interesting. I think a lot of the world loved it more than you or I did. The Zone of Interest, Jonathan Glazer's fixation on how to flatten emotion, push things as far from being dramatic, cinematically manipulative or whatever as possible, makes so much sense with this film. It is the story of a commandant of Auschwitz and his family who are living next to the concentration camps. His job is basically as an operations manager of sorts. He's going through the daily bureaucratic, boring, banal kind of work conversations. At one point, he's recording a message telling people not to pick too many lilacs because the lilac bushes are for everyone to share, and if you pick them all, then we won't have as beautiful a campus anymore. There are things that you can imagine 1,000 different ways this story could be a sort of heightened, damning satire, almost like a Jojo Rabbit, right? Like, you could imagine a version of this story that is, we are going to tell this drama straight, and the audience will see some kind of dark, damning humor by virtue of the way that we're treating these characters with dignity. Jonathan Glazer does not do that. The Zone of Interest plays like they described it as like
Big Brother,
Nazi Big Brother, essentially. And that is 100% how it feels. This is a film that is It's 10 cameras that were set up in this house that they constructed to recreate this family's house. And it is just watching people going from room to room, having conversations, draining all the emotion that they can from this. And it is very much a critique of the kind of structures that allow great atrocities like the Holocaust to exist. You know, the banality of evil, the bureaucracy, the way you can turn into someone who doesn't feel human emotions anymore by just going through your life with blinders on and choosing not to think about the ramifications of your actions. I thought this movie was just absolutely stunning. It is like technically perfectly achieves what it wanted to achieve, which is this daring statement that is making the audience wrestle with themselves, with how they feel. In this conversation around Oppenheimer of depiction versus omission, and like what are the moral requirements of a filmmaker to depict atrocities versus do they run the risk of dramatizing them by depicting them? I think this movie is a major artistic landmine in that conversation that is taking it to the furthest extreme with very, very, very clear intent. I mean, it does have harrowing moments largely in the audio. Like there are times where it is hinting at the periphery of what is going on and clearly trying to remind the audience of the atrocities happening just next door. I think this would be just an interesting art house film if not for some moments where Glazer deviates from that. There are a few kind of experimental things thrown in where a fable is being told and the film is doing some really interesting things depicting that happening. There's what I would call a musical moment somewhat late in the film that normally, with no context, I wouldn't feel anything, but with the volume of emotions lowered so much the way he does here, I find it just incredibly moving. And some tricks toward the end that I think are just really interesting in pointing the camera back on the audience. I think this is just such a complete, interesting, damning work of art. And I really, really, really am... Love is like the wrong word because this is not an emotional movie at all, but I feel that it is very powerful. And I love that this is something out in the world that people can grapple with.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a film that I appreciate more than like. It is I am very, very narrative forward in the things that I consume, and I mean, it's stupid to say enjoy when you're talking about the subject matter of this film, but like the things that really pull me into a film will be the narrative, and this film is sort of absent of narrative, but what it lacks in narrative, it is completely immersed in depicting something without depicting it. Like as we were walking away, I forget exactly what I said, but it was something like, this is like the most subtle, unsubtle film that's ever existed. Like it is what you are watching is not in your face, but it's still also completely unsubtle in how like damning it is, but it's also a very, very simple idea, but it's everything that you're watching is outside of the frame. You know, when you talk about like horror films and not showing the monster until the end, this film is always both showing you and not showing you the monster. It's showing you like the monstrosity of what is happening, but it also is just showing people working around the house and doing their own thing, having conversations, sometimes about horrible stuff, sometimes just about whatever they're talking about at the time, the cakes that they're eating or whatever. You know, it's just, this is a film where you can almost watch this film with your eyes closed and still kind of get as much out of it as watching it with your eyes open. I mean, you would also miss all the, you know, brilliant choices of how to depict things visually, but half of what this film is doing is just like right on the other side of the fence are horrible atrocities happening, and you're always privy to them being there, but the scene you are watching has nothing to do with that, and that's kind of the point. And it's just like a really, really interesting way to talk about this subject matter, and it's just like one of those things where like I was blown away by what the film was doing. It wasn't a movie that I liked, but it was like, I really, really understand what you're doing, and that was an amazing way to decide to do that. But it's like, it's not, it's like, it's hard for me to tell somebody to go watch this film, but if you go watch this film, you will get a lot out of it. Mm-hmm. So it's this weird push and pull for me there, where it's like, brilliant film. I really believe in what it was trying to do. I don't know who should watch it.
Yeah, and my feeling is that everyone should watch it because it's interesting because saying it out loud, what it's wrestling with seems obvious. Like, it's easy to say, how do we live comfortably in a world where evil, horrible things are happening? You know, how do you live with yourself when you are tuning out suffering and potentially upholding systems that are doing terrible things to other people?
Yeah.
That is very much true today. It was true in, you know, the 1940s. It is true in every decade. But there's something about having to sit with the discomfort of this movie that I do really think lingers and challenges in an interesting way. And I don't know what new insight there is to pull from that thing, like meditating on the banality of evil has been around forever. But there's just something about this movie that I feel like is a bracing cold water in the face that is very interesting and important. And I think, I just think it's something that stirs something in you. And I think it's something that I hope people will check out when it comes out, even though it is the furthest thing from the stand and cheer TIFF type movie that could possibly be premiering at this festival. Yeah. But anecdotally, like, I was excited to watch this a second time because I wanted to know how it would land in the festival. Like, people were blown away by this movie, but Cannes is a little bit more artsy, provocative, you know, wanting things to make you uncomfortable. This movie, I felt like there was kind of a stunned silence around it in the TIFF crowd, and it seemed like people really, really, really went for it still. So anecdotally, it has the power to move and stun people, even if they are more of your, quote, typical moviegoer who want to stand up and cheer for something. So I'm just excited for the conversations around this movie. And I think, you know, you mentioned you could just listen to it without watching it, and I totally get what you're saying. But I think, for as much as they claim that they're draining this movie of emotion, I think it looks amazing. Like, the composition of this movie is incredibly striking and memorable, and it feels like an old school Kubrick movie or something, like 2001. It's like Alien, almost, like Under the Skin. You know, it's making people into this strange, robotic alien thing, and that I just think it's so fucking interesting.
And you know, the comparison to Jojo Rabbit is, you know, obvious in theme, but also when you think about, like, what those two films are doing, is Jojo Rabbit is pointing at, can you believe this type of thing was actually going on? But it's making a joke. It's taking a heightened reality to make a joke about a thing so that you can comment on the fact that this is like a reality that, you know, people participated in. This film is going around the other side of that and going into the actual mechanics and, like, what is doing your job well,
right,
when you are the person in charge of a concentration camp. Like what new technologies do you bring to the front? Like, it's taking it to a place where even if you've thought a lot about it, you've probably never thought about it like this. Like, what would be the best manager of the horror? You know, like it's very, very interesting concept in depicting it in this way. And it's like, I was constantly being blown away by just ideas it was putting forth on what these characters were doing and having these conversations about. You know, it's almost like if you go back to Oppenheimer, like, the dude who picked where to drop the bomb, it would be like, what if the whole movie was just following that guy
100%.
and
or the boardrooms where those decisions are being made.
Yeah, and it's like it's doing something really, really compelling, and it's definitely a really interesting thought exercise to, like, experience this film. So yeah, that's one of the ways that I would recommend it. But yeah, so yeah, this is part one, as we said, of our coverage of TIFF 2023. Stephen Miller, if people want to find you that week, where can they do that?
If people want to find me, they can go to twitter.com/sdavidmiller or sdavidmiller.com.
People can find me at christopherinreallife.com or twitter.com/christopherrl. You can find the podcast over at thespoilerwarning.com, where you can get a bunch of the back episodes of the show. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do so in Overcast, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts are found. Let's see. If you want to know the episodes go live, you can follow us at twitter.com/spoilerwarning, facebook.com/thespoilerwarning, or instagram.com/thespoilerwarning. If you want to get a hold of us directly, you can send an email to fans@thespoilerwarning.com, or you can use the contact form on our site. Music for this episode will probably be a jingle from a trailer for TIFF if I can find it. So hopefully you are enjoying that playing right now. And yes, we are about to head off to go see a little film called Hitman. So get ready for that in another 2 parts whenever we get to actually recording that. But yeah, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.